It started with silence. Not the kind you hear, but the kind you feel when everyone stops looking at you the same way. When your name disappears from the project file, when your lunch invitations vanish, when your voice in meetings gets accidentally talked over. Jeremiah knew that silence well, and he knew exactly when it began. It wasn't long after someone found a blog post he'd written years ago, back when he was braver than he had words for. A quiet piece buried deep in a personal website about being a queer teenager in a small town, and about the boy he once met in a gay AOL chat room under the username BlueJays10. At the time, Jeremiah thought no one would ever read it, certainly not someone from the office. But in New York, in advertising, silence travels faster than sound. They didn't fire him, that would have been too loud. Instead, they froze him out, one email at a time. When he finally handed in his resignation, there was no confrontation. No raised voices, just a "we understand" from the HR manager in a meeting invite that vanished from his calendar like smoke. He boxed up his desk in under 15 minutes. As he unplugged his monitor, his eyes landed on something wedged in the back of the bottom drawer. An old USB translucent blue, barely functioning, with a piece of worn tape across it labeled J14. He almost tossed it, but something stopped him. Back at his apartment, a walk-up studio with paper-thin walls and a view of someone else's window, Jeremiah sat down at his second-hand laptop and plugged it in. The drive buzzed, whined, and then opened. There was one file, just one. It was a screenshot, pixelated, yellowed at the edges from time. Two avatars on an AOL chat window. One was him, J14, the other Blue J17. The last message he ever sent sitting in that chat box like a held breath. "I'll wait here if you ever come back." He stared at the screen until his eyes blurred. That conversation had happened over 15 years ago, but the ache in his chest hadn't aged a day. It was that night he opened a job board just to feel like he had options, like he hadn't burned every bridge behind him. That's when he saw it. Open Verse Foundation. Now hiring. Director of LGBTQ+ Communication Strategy. He clicked on the listing. It was a nonprofit based in Manhattan dedicated to amplifying queer voices, especially from communities of color and rural backgrounds. Their mission wasn't polished. It was raw, messy, real. And in the middle of the description it read, "We're looking for someone who's lived the silence and is ready to speak." Something about that line made his hands tremble. The application was straightforward. Resume portfolio cover letter. And then at the very end, a single optional question. Has someone ever believed in you when no one else did? Tell us, Jeremiah thought for a moment. Then without overthinking, he typed, yes. His name was Blue. I never got to thank him. He didn't think he'd hear back. Not really. Not after everything. Not when his past seemed like a closed chapter. Only he still reread. But the next morning an email came. "We'd love to speak with you, in-person interview, 10 a.m., 17th floor. And just like that, the silence shifted. Not shattered, not yet, but cracked just enough to let something through. A name, a memory, a file labeled J14, and the boy who once said, "You're not alone, not as long as I'm here." Jeremiah didn't know it yet, but the past wasn't behind him. It was waiting. If this story touched something in you, a name you remember, a silence you've lived through, or a message left unanswered, then you're not alone. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more stories about LGBTQ+ lives. Memory and the quiet kind of bravery that changes everything. Let's keep these stories alive. Jeremiah hadn't worn a blazer in months. Not since his last presentation, the one where no one made eye contact with him until he left the stage. It still hung on the back of his closet, a little dusty, slightly too loose around the shoulders now. He brushed it off anyway and buttoned it up with the kind of care people give to things they aren't sure they deserve to wear anymore. The train ride downtown was quiet. He sat by the window and watched the city blur past, scaffolding, steam rising from the grates, people walking like they had somewhere to be. He used to be one of them. The Open Verse Foundation was in a glass building near Madison Square Park, not towering like the tech giants, but clean, intentional. A black and white flag flew just beneath the rainbow. One, he knew what that meant. This space sees more than what's obvious. The lobby had plants, real ones, not those corporate palms, but vines hanging low green with imperfect leaves. The receptionist smiled and said his name before he introduced himself. That startled him. "You'll be meeting with the Director of Communications. Take the elevator to 1717. He pressed the button. The doors closed. Each floor felt like a memory. 4. The age he first realized he was different. 7. When his father stopped tucking him, in 10. When he first learned the word fugget. 14. When he met Blue Jay Senin. 17. When he said goodbye without meaning to. The doors opened with a soft chime. The hallway was quiet, minimalist, full of posters showing LGBTQ+ youth in rural towns, drag performers in their Sunday best, black and brown elders holding hands with pride. This wasn't rainbow capitalism. This was truth. The interview room was already open. There was water, a notepad, a folder with his name printed on clean white paper. He sat and waited. The door clicked. A man entered. Early 30s, tall, neatly dressed, but not overdone. Confident posture, a presence that arrived before he spoke. "Hi, I'm Zayden Hall, Director of Communications." Jeremiah nodded politely. The name didn't register. He was too busy trying not to shake. The interview began with the usual questions. Experience, strategy, his work with crisis, messaging, how he'd handled discrimination at previous jobs. He answered calmly, cleanly. Zayden took notes, nodded, asked follow-ups. Professional, warm. But something in his voice was vaguely familiar, like a song hummed once in childhood, almost remembered. Then Zayden flipped to the last page of the application. His brow shifted. There was a pause, a long one. He looked up. Eyes different now, searching. "You wrote something here," he said slowly. His name was Blue. Jeremiah's chest tightened. Zayden reached into his wallet. No hesitation, no explanation. He pulled out a folded square of paper, worn and soft at the corners. He opened it like something sacred. Jeremiah froze. It was the same screenshot, the same final message. "I'll wait here if you ever come back." Zayden's voice wasn't steady anymore. "J14, is that you?" Jeremiah couldn't speak. He nodded once. That was all he could manage. Zayden sat back, a hand over his mouth. His shoulders dropped like something had been holding them up too long. "I didn't think I'd ever get to return that message," Jeremiah whispered. "You kept it." "I didn't have anything else from then. Not the computer, not the chats, but that message that was mine. I printed it out before my dad found the laptop." Jeremiah remembered now. Blue had vanished overnight. No warning, just gone. And now here he was, not a memory, not a ghost, but a man sitting across from him, holding proof that it all had been real. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Finally, Zayden broke the silence. "Do you want the job?" Jeremiah blinked. Zayden smiled, bittersweet. "That's not how we usually do this, but I think you've been waiting long enough." The interview room had emptied. Technically, it had never been full. Just 2 men, 2 paths, and 1 message that had never stopped echoing. After Zayden asked if Jeremiah wanted the job, there was a shift, not professional, not performative, something older, something raw. Zayden set the resume folder aside and leaned back like he'd finally dropped a weight he didn't know he was carrying. They didn't talk about job titles anymore. They talked about silence. Zayden spoke first. "My father found the chat logs, all of them. He thought I was being groomed or corrupted or sick. He didn't care what the truth was. He smashed the computer, threw my phone out the window, sent me to a church-run camp in Arizona the next morning." Jeremiah's stomach turned. "I didn't even know where I was for 3 days." Zayden continued. "They took everything. Internet contact with friends, even mirrors. Said if I could see myself, I'd stay broken." Jeremiah nodded, not because he understood the details, but because he recognized the pattern. That quiet violence, the kind that doesn't leave bruises, but rewrites who you think you are. "I kept waiting for your message," Jeremiah said softly, "for months." "I know," Zayden replied, "and I kept hearing yours in my head. I'll wait here." It became this lighthouse. I didn't believe I'd ever see it again, but it was there blinking in the dark. Jeremiah swallowed hard. "You were the first person who saw me. Not just what I liked, not what I was afraid of. You saw me." Zayden nodded. "You were the only place I could be honest." There was a long pause, not uncomfortable, just sacred. Then Jeremiah asked the question that had haunted him since he was 15. "Did you ever think of reaching out after you got out?" Zayden looked down. His jaw tightened. "I did," he said, "but I didn't know how to find you. I didn't know your name. Just J14. I didn't even remember the city you lived in. And honestly, I was scared. I thought maybe you'd moved on. Maybe I'd ruined something that mattered more to me than it did to you." "You didn't ruin it," Jeremiah whispered. Zayden smiled sadly. Then why does it still feel like I left a fire burning in someone else's house? They both sat with that feeling, that odd ache of loving someone through absence, of being shaped by a person who wasn't there but still lived in every decision you made. I printed your message before my dad took everything, Zayden said. I told myself if I ever met someone again who made me feel safe, I'd tell them about you, but no one ever did. So the message just stayed in my wallet. Jeremiah looked at the man in front of him, grown polished, confident, but still holding that same gentle flame from 15 years ago. You know what's strange, Jeremiah said. I never told anyone about you either. Not even when I came out. Not when I got my first boyfriend. Not even in therapy. It always felt too sacred, like saying your name out loud would take something away from it. Zayden blinked visibly, moved. You were real to me, he said. More real than most people I've met in person. The lights outside had begun to dim. Office windows across the city flickered off one by one. But inside that small room on the 17th floor, two men were rediscovering something that had never truly left, a connection that outlived Wi-Fi broken homes and the years they lost themselves trying to survive. Zayden stood up and walked to the small bookshelf behind the desk. He picked up a slim black notebook and held it out to Jeremiah. We're launching a new campaign, he said. Stories of reconnection, of people who lost touch and found each other again in the most unexpected ways. We didn't have a title, but maybe now we do. Jeremiah opened the notebook. The first page was blank. Zayden handed him a pen. Will you write the first entry? Jeremiah didn't answer right away. He just smiled and wrote, Once I met a boy in a chat room, I thought he disappeared. Turns out he was just finding his way back. The notebook stayed with Jeremiah long after the interview ended. He tucked it into the inside pocket of his blazer, where the fabric still held the warmth of the room they'd shared. A room not built for reconciliation, yet somehow made to hold it. He didn't go home right away. Instead, he wandered the streets of Manhattan, letting the city buzz around him like background noise in a movie he wasn't starring in. The subways rattled beneath him, horns cut through the dusk, and above it all, his thoughts replayed moments that had never asked to be remembered. They just never left. Zayden had told his story. Now Jeremiah felt the weight of his own. It didn't start with coming out, it started before he even knew what to come out as. It started with shame, not loud shame, not the kind that comes with slurs or slammed doors. His was quieter, polite church-fed, soft-spoken family dinners where certain topics were inappropriate, certain commercials got switched off, and certain kids got told to act normal when they danced a little too freely to the radio. He learned early how to shrink himself, how to be agreeable, how to laugh at the jokes he didn't understand because not laughing raised questions. And questions were dangerous. By the time he was 14, Jeremiah had mastered invisibility, which is why meeting Blue Jay Sentine hit him like sunlight in a locked attic. He remembered that first chat vividly, how Blue didn't just ask, "How are you?" but meant it, how he didn't mock Jeremiah for liking Coldplay or being afraid of gym class or crying during Pixar movies. Instead, Blue said things like, "Same, I thought I was the only one." It was the first time Jeremiah had ever felt seen, not observed but understood. And then just as suddenly it ended. No goodbye, no explanation. Just absence, and it did something to him. After that, Jeremiah built his life like an insurance policy. He dated only when it felt safe. He never fell too hard, never stayed too long. He learned to be grateful for surface-level affection, to be content with relationships that didn't ask him to bleed, because the one person who once made him feel infinite had vanished without a trace, so he told himself it was a phase of fantasy. Something teenage boys invent to make the nights quieter. But it wasn't, it was real. Zayden's face, his voice, his memory, proved it. And now Jeremiah couldn't hide behind the stories he used to survive. Not anymore back home. He sat on the edge of his bed, still in that old blazer. The notebook rested in his lap. Its blank pages seemed to pulse. He opened to the second page and wrote, "After Blue left, I became the version of myself people wanted. I got good at fitting in, blending, folding, but I never stopped looking over my shoulder. Not for him exactly, but for the part of me that vanished with him." He paused, then beneath it added, "Now he's back, but I'm not the boy he left behind. I don't know if he'll like this version of me, but maybe it's time I find out." The next day, Jeremiah returned to the Open Verse office to sign his paperwork. Zayden met him in the lobby, not with a handshake, with coffee. Flat white, no sugar, 1 pump hazelnut, Zayden said, holding it out. You once told me that in a message, remember, said it was your dream coffee if you ever made it to a big city. Jeremiah blinked. He didn't remember that detail. But Zayden had, as they rode the elevator together, Zayden turned to him and said, I meant what I said. I want you here not just because you're good, but because I think this place needs your voice. Jeremiah looked at him for a long time, then replied, I think I need mine too. The elevator doors opened onto the 17th floor, but this time Jeremiah didn't feel like he was arriving for an interview. He felt like he was coming home. The 17th floor looked different now, not because the office had changed, but because Jeremiah had. The shadows that once clung to the corners of his thoughts had softened. It didn't mean he had no fear, but he wasn't living from it anymore. His first week at Openverse was a quiet reintroduction to his own voice. He sat in meetings, took notes, gave feedback, and watched how his ideas landed differently here. Not dismissed, not stolen, not filtered. Here people actually leaned in when he spoke. They listened. But the project that mattered most began on a Thursday. Zayden called it Echoes We Never Got to Answer. It was a campaign built around forgotten digital friendships, online conversations between queer youth that shaped them, saved them, or haunted them. The goal wasn't just nostalgia, it was healing, reconnection, visibility for all the unseen moments that never made it into coming out speeches or headlines. They launched it with a simple idea: invite people to send in the last message they never got to finish. Within 48 hours, their inbox overflowed. Screenshots from 2002, typed out memories from MySpace Live, journal early Reddit threads, messages that said, I think I like you, promise you won't tell. If I disappear, it's not because of you. Some came with endings, most didn't. One submission stopped. Jeremiah cold. It read, I was J14. I never thought I'd be brave enough to say this, but Blue, if you're out there, I waited every day. And I still hope it wasn't from him. Someone else had once used the same username, but it didn't matter. The story was everywhere now. The pattern, the ache, the quiet hope. A few days later, Zayden entered Jeremiah's office holding a letter. Not an email, not a printout, an actual letter sealed by hand in a white envelope with no return address. He placed it gently on the desk. Jeremiah opened it. Inside was a photo of 2 teenage boys. Pixelated, low resolution, clearly taken from an old webcam. They were both wearing headphones, grinning at their screens, frozen in digital youth. On the back, one line, you don't know me, but your story gave me the courage to find mine. Jeremiah stared at it for a long time. He thought of the lonely boy he used to be, the one who waited in silence, and the man he'd become, who now gave others permission to speak. Later that night, he and Zayden sat on the rooftop of the building, legs dangling over the city they once felt too small for. Do you ever wonder, Jeremiah asked, what would have happened if your dad hadn't found that laptop? Zayden nodded all the time. And I think we would have burned out fast. We were kids. We had no language, no roadmap. Maybe we had to lose each other to become who we needed to be. Jeremiah looked over at the soft smile playing on his lips. And who's that? Zayden held up his phone on the screen. The campaign had just reached 1 million views, thousands of messages, hundreds of stories. He turned the screen to Jeremiah and said, the ones who came back for themselves, for each other. They sat there silent. Not like the silence Jeremiah used to know, the kind that erased him. This one held space, this one made room, this one stayed. Have you ever written a message you were too scared to send? A name you typed but never hit enter? A voice that once saved you but you never got to thank? At Heart Stories, we believe some of the most powerful moments in our lives aren't the ones we shouted, but the ones we whispered into the dark, hoping someone was out there. Subscribe to join a community where those whispers still matter, where stories return when you least expect them, and where you just might find yourself in someone else's words. What message have you never finished? Tell us. Someone might be waiting.